virtual room with us. My name is Tina Walla, and I'm with US Digital Response. I'll be your moderator for today's session, and it's really, I have to confess, I'm so excited I got this session because this is the one I wanted to attend. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Forum Fest 2023 session titled Pushing Paper, Building Flexibility into a Paper Form When Digital Isn't an Option. I'm really excited about this session. I have to tell you because this is one form of a formative form story. One of my previous stints in government, I worked for the city of Seattle. I got so excited and inspired by the lab at DC because they held a Formapalooza where they brought to life what real participatory community engagement looks like on forums. So I have to tell you, I am nerding out and so excited for today's presentation. I'll share that this is going to be a 1-hour session. Our speakers will present first, and then we're going to save the last 20 minutes for questions from all of you. If you have a question during the presentation, just drop it in the chat. My partner, Colleen, is going to be tracking and aggregating all your questions. We're going to save that for a 20-minute Q&A period at the end. I'll voice those out loud so the recording can capture those questions and answers for folks who are watching after today. Now, enough of me. Let's get to the real stars of the show. I want to turn the session over to Debra Scott, Nellie Moore, and Ryan Flynn. Ryan is going to get us started by sharing his formative form story. So Ryan, take it away.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, everyone at Code for America and the Beeck Center. It's really a pleasure to be here. Tina, we're happy you're our moderator too. And we're happy to have a chance to nerd out with a bunch of other self-described form geeks this afternoon or morning, depending on where you're coming from. So when I was just starting to work, I did my taxes by hand from beginning to end for several years. Part of it was that I wanted to learn about the process and the form. Part of it was I felt like it was my civic duty to understand those things. And part of it was I was doing a lot of work internationally and the tax preparation softwares didn't really meet my needs. And I learned that the paper you see is just the beginning. It requires an awful lot of heartache and decision-making and research. All of that is behind the form, but integral to the experience. And I carry that with me. And so we want to talk about today something that may seem to you a bit unusual for a focus on, or the focus of this event on digital service delivery. We want to talk about paper. Now, we're not here to tell you that we've seen the future and it's made from trees, but we do want to talk a little bit about when one might choose not to make the move to be digital. We hear very much the benefits that have been coming up through this entire conference related to accessibility, speed, flexibility, responsiveness. But we also agree with the director from the White House last year that noted that only 2% of federal forms have been digitized, that there's a lot of work left to do. And that's true for us in the District of Columbia government as well. And that will take time. And so we want to talk a little bit about how we manage that. While I'm introducing us, I'd like to start off with a quick poll just so we can learn a little bit about you as well. You should see on the right-hand side of your screen that a poll's come up. And so we're interested to know, what's the focus of your work? Well, I tell you a little bit about us. The work we're sharing today is all housed within the government of the District of Columbia, the city of Washington, D.C., but it's a collaboration across many different agencies. That includes the District of Columbia Housing Authority, which provides quality, affordable housing for low to moderate income residents through public housing like Section 8, investments in mixed income communities, and also housing vouchers, which is the focus of our work today. They work very closely with our Department of Human Services, or DHS, to help folks access vouchers. And DHS supports residents to access public benefits, provides youth community services, and provides services for residents who are housing insecure or unhoused. And this project fits very much in that third bucket. We are here representing much larger teams. And we're lucky to have Debra Scott with us from the Housing Authority, who's going to tell us a little bit about some of the work in a moment. But let me introduce Nellie and myself first. We work at an organization called the Lab at DC. We sit in the office of the city administrator, fairly centrally in district government. And we're a team of social scientists, data scientists, and designers who partner with agencies on service delivery challenges. It could be an evaluation. In this case, it's a design challenge to improve the experience of applying for a housing voucher in Washington, DC. All our work happens through deep partnerships with government agencies. We provide some technical know-how and a willingness to roll up our sleeves, but the agencies really lead the work. In this particular project, our team at the Lab at DC was complemented and augmented by 5 resident researchers. These are folks who currently hold housing vouchers, who we hired for both their research expertise and their experience going through the process. And they helped us with research design, with the synthesis of information, and with generating recommendations. And the work is much richer for their input. I want to make sure that folks are seeing the results of the poll before I close it. Does everyone have a sense of who they are, who's here? So it looks like we have a good mix of folks who work on primarily digital, primarily on paper, PDF, in both, which is good. Hopefully there's something for everybody here, and maybe we don't need to be the apologists for paper first that we think we do. But we want to tell you about 3 things today. The first is want to tell you a little bit about the context and the problems that the Housing Authority and DHS and the lab sought to address, and why paper first made sense in that context. Then we want to tell you about a couple strategies that we've used to make the process as seamless and intuitive and smooth as possible, given the limitations of paper. And finally, we want to tell you a little bit about where we're going next. And it's important to note that this work is very much still in progress. We're not here to sort of claim victory. And we want to share it in the spirit of sharing early and sharing something that's in process, because we want to hear from you as well. And so your questions and comments today will enrich the conversation, but will also enrich our work. So thank you very, very much for being here with us. With that, let me turn it over to Debra, who's going to talk a little bit about the context. Oh, Debra, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Ryan. So what is a housing voucher? It is a government subsidy that helps low-income individuals and families afford a place to live. The recipients choose their rental unit and pay about 30% of their income towards rent, while the voucher covers the rest. But vouchers vary depending on the government agency that manages them, who funds them, meaning the federal government or local government, which applicants qualify for them, and where the vouchers can be used. So tenant-based vouchers can be used in the private market, while unit-based vouchers are used in designated buildings. So the problem is that no one is on the same page. And the reason why no one's on the same page is because, as you see here, there are different application paths depending on the type of voucher for which one is applying, either a federally funded or a locally funded voucher. Some applicants follow the federal path, where they apply directly to the Housing Authority to be placed on our waiting list. And then when they're selected from the list, then they're sent a packet of forms to complete. But many applicants follow the local path, where they apply through one of several pathways facilitated by the Department of Human Services that matches them with a local voucher and also connects them with a case manager who assists them with filling out the forms. And regarding the application itself, for the federal path, once an applicant fills out their forms, they return the complete application packet to the Housing Authority, along with supporting documents to prove things like their identity, income, etc. And for the local path, where case managers assist the applicants with filling out their forms, if they're missing any verification documents, they can complete a self-certification form to certify things like their identity, age, income, etc. And then their case managers certify their residency in the District of Columbia. Now, regarding the review of these applications for the federal path, once the application and supporting documents are received by the Housing Authority, they're reviewed for accuracy and completion. And if anything is missing, then the Housing Authority reaches out directly to the applicant. But for the local path, the case manager submits the application and supporting documents to the Department of Human Services, where they review everything. And then if something's missing, they contact the case manager if more is needed. Once the Department of Human Services completes their review and confirms that everything is good, then the application is forwarded to the Housing Authority for review. So as you can see, the processes and forms used across these different pathways are not always the same. And this form revision is fairly unique in our history because two agencies play a significant role in the application process that the form supports. So creating a form that meets both agencies' needs and uses has required a lot of coordination and partnership with senior staff at both agencies. Okay, so here are some numbers related to our current forms. There are currently 41 pages total in the current application, with a minimum of 22 pages needed to complete the application and a maximum of 32 pages for completion. And the reason why there are 41 total pages but a maximum of 32 for completion is because not all forms are required for every applicant. And it takes about an hour and a half for an applicant to get through the application packet, complete all the forms. And it typically takes 30 days for the Housing Authority to determine eligibility. Sometimes it does take longer because of some of the pain points in the process that can lead to delays, which we'll talk about in a subsequent slide. Some of the big ones include needing to go back to clients because forms aren't filled out correctly, or if required verification documents are not submitted. And the complicated nature of managing a workflow across two agencies can also add to the processing time. This form revision grew out of the Department of Human Services concern with voucher utilization and the agreement between them and the Housing Authority that the current form is a barrier to a smooth experience for applicants and staff alike. Some of the improvements that we hope the redesign will contribute toward are quicker turnarounds, because different requirements across voucher types can lead to confusion, mistakes, and applications being sent back for correction. So clearer instructions could mean fewer mistakes and faster review times. Streamlined and secure workflow, because in a paper and email-based system with a lot of back and forth, forms can be lost and personal information is harder to keep safe. Better alignment, because case managers often lack technical support on how to complete the application, and there's not just one source of truth on the requirements. And ultimately, more capacity, because many more local vouchers were funded in 2022 and 2023, and ultimately a more streamlined application process would allow the Housing Authority to house more eligible applicants. And here we're doing another poll about the biggest challenge you face in your work on forms and notices. And we're just going to take a moment to take a look at those. Okay. Okay. Well, here's a quote by Department of Human Services staff member. It's difficult to work with a different agency and rely on one another to serve clients. It makes the process convoluted and unnecessarily complicated. It confuses residents and leaves them frustrated. I think we can all relate to the challenges that come with collaborating with people outside of our groups and organizations. And so for us, while the need for collaboration isn't likely to go away, better alignment between the Housing Authority and Department of Human Services through and beyond the forms themselves may reduce confusion for everyone in the process. And now I will hand it off to you, Nellie.
Thanks, Debra. I see that quite a lot of people shared that they also have issues with process alignment across teams and agencies as the biggest challenge they face in their work on forms and notices. Okay. This is where we'll really get into the meaty bits about how we've gone about this paper form redesign. And first, I'll tell you a little bit about our process overall. And then, like Ryan previewed, we'll talk about some of the strategies and tactics that we use to make the absolute most that we could out of a paper-based form revision. We started this work early this year. We began by mapping the various resident paths. We cataloged around 40 discrete forms and notices that residents may encounter in applying for a voucher. And when we audited those forms, we generated over 500 questions and comments with senior members of the Housing Authority and the Department of Human Services to determine the program and legal constraints of the redesign. Now, this 500 number, it's an easy to measure number because we tracked these back and forths in Adobe. But it doesn't quite sort of convey the hours of meetings that the Housing Authority and the lab had discussing forms together and separately. And so what I really want to convey in this number is just how much investigation it can take to understand an existing system of forms before you even start to think about changing anything about them. We also observed residents, case managers, and DHS and Housing Authority staff who process and quality assure the applications to identify common errors. And at this stage, we did a review of the regulations that oversee the voucher process. There's quite a lot, both on the local and federal level. And we continue to refer back to them as we developed and tested the forms. All of that provided the building blocks that we needed for a revised packet. Our goal was not to recreate all 41 pages of the forms, but really we were looking to create a more streamlined application packet that clearly walks applicants through what everyone fills out, what is only needed if you're applying for a federal program or a local program, and how to verify things like income and student status. And once we had developed all of those pieces, we tested them in modules with residents, the Housing Authority, DHS staff, case managers, and third parties that included employers, schools, care providers, notaries, etc. We are so close. We're just about ready to start piloting these new forms, and I'm so excited. But I'll tell you more about those next steps toward the end of the presentation. So now we will narrow in on a few tactics that we use to make the most of this redesign. As Ryan stated at the top of the presentation, just in case you came in a little bit late, we are redesigning the voucher application forms in paper. That means that they will be completed using a fillable PDF or printed or filled in by hand. And given that most of this event is focused on some really great digital work, we know that this makes us somewhat the oddballs, but we think that we're in good company based on the poll that you all did. And we also know that starting with paper allowed us to start right away. Even as the solutions needed for a fully online application process were considered and vetted and explored further, and it also allowed us to introduce improvements incrementally. So maybe you find yourself in the same boat and you'd like to think more about what you can do if digital is not an immediate option. And we found that there is quite a lot that we could do just with paper to address the pain points that we are seeing in the process. We'll tell you how we used modules to reduce the number of forms each applicant completes to get closer to that minimum or maximum number, right? And having fewer people actually touch all 41 forms. And Ryan will tell you more about that. And then finally, I'll talk about what paper can't do on its own, and some exploration that we've done around complementary digital solutions to address those gaps. So Debra, I'd love to pass it back to you to say more about why and how we did the redesign in paper. Debra, you gotta unmute.
I am so sorry. So where we're starting from now is that applications are submitted primarily by email scans, postal mail, or hand delivery. And then PDF versions of the applications are uploaded into various databases and manually transcribed into database fields. And there are over 500 case managers from various housing partners and agencies and dozens of Department of Human Services and Housing Authority staff. Now, the process is complex but manual, and it involves many, many parties. And changing it will take time, but both to create the digital solutions and to manage the transition to digital. But meanwhile, there is still a lot we can do with paper. One thing we can do with paper is to align the forms with our current systems. And the paper redesign can alleviate pain points and address delays. What you see here are, it compares the first page of our current application on the top, which includes a lot of information that is no longer accurate, and some of it just isn't needed, to the new version on the bottom, which reflects our decision to be much more specific about what someone is applying for. And recently, the District of Columbia has also started funding local vouchers, as you saw earlier with the multiple paths. These local vouchers have different requirements, but those are not reflected in the current forms. And Ryan will discuss momentarily how the redesigned forms address this issue. Okay, so anything we can do with paper forms, another thing we can do with paper forms is to reduce redundancies. Here you can see at the top part of our current application where demographic information is asked. And then you will see at the bottom where this is a section of our packet that we use for applicants to actually, for us to determine their eligibility. And you notice that the same questions, are duplicated here. Now, when the wait list was open, applicants completed one set of forms to get on the waiting list, and that's the housing application, the one at the top. And then once they were selected from the list to determine their eligibility, then they had to complete another set of forms, and that's the example at the bottom. So now the waitlist has been closed for many years, and some of the information on the application, as I said before, may be missing or outdated. And as a result, the Housing Authority was asking people to complete the waitlist application again, in addition to the forms to check their eligibility. These redundancies don't only extend the time it takes to fill out the forms, but when someone makes a mistake and the fields don't match, the review process takes a lot longer too. And here you can see an example of where the redesigned form removes those redundancies that we just saw between the two sets of forms. And beyond these tactical approaches, there are also strategic reasons to start with paper. Even after a digital application is developed, some applicants will continue to need or prefer paper, so we expect the paper forms to remain in use for some time. In addition, hashing out the issues on paper means that even before putting fingers to code on a digital application, the many parties involved in the process agree on what should be included in the forms. And it's important to note that case managers meet with clients experiencing homelessness where they are to assist them with filling out the application. And this can be done in tents on the street, at shelters, etc. So sometimes paper truly is the only accessible option. And now I will hand it back to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Debra. So with that context, I want to talk next a little bit about how we're working within the limits of paper to provide as efficient and accessible and pleasant an eligibility determination packet as possible. And we're using the term modular logic to describe our approach. As Debra mentioned, the current eligibility packet services a variety of programs, each with slightly different information needs. What that means is that no matter who you are, what program you're entering, everybody can skip something. With a digital application, you could use screener questions, branching, skip logic to help make sure that folks were only encountering the questions they needed to answer. We wanted to follow that approach as closely as possible, given a paper format. And I want to share 3 strategies about how we're approaching this. The first is breaking the application into 3 modules, of which anyone would only complete 2. The second is using skip logic and building in design patterns to try to make the navigation through the packet as clear and intuitive as possible. And the third is thinking a little bit differently about how we use forms to verify. And so let's talk about the first one first. Yeah, on this slide, you see our approach to modules. And so the current packet is 41 pages. And when I say current, I mean the pre-revised one, because we haven't quite rolled this out yet. So the current packet is 41 pages. Everyone gets the same packet. And oftentimes people fill out much of that packet, even though certain forms don't apply. The biggest differences here are between federally and locally funded vouchers. For example, the program rules for local vouchers don't require a criminal background check or a check with the U.S. Customs and Immigration to check for legal presence. On the other hand, local programs have more restrictive District of Columbia residency requirements. Our modular approach breaks out the forms that are only needed for federal or local programs and sort of mixes up what's in the current application packet to get that distinction. So your application packet will only ever include an 8 to 14 page core and then either a 5-page local supplement or a 9-page federal supplement. Now, this approach relies on something that may not apply everywhere, so I just want to call it out. For this process, there's always a housing authority staff member or a staff member at a partner agency intermediating the eligibility determination process. This isn't an application you download by yourself and then can just sort of complete and send in. It's either sent to you by a case manager when there's a determination made that there's a match for a voucher, or when your name is pulled off the wait list. You also don't get to choose between a local and a federal voucher. At the time that match is made, that decision is made for you based on availability and in some cases program fit. So at any rate, because of that, it's possible to curate a core and 1 supplement. Now, if you go to the next slide, Nellie, I want to talk about another strategy, which is trying to do the best we can with visual design elements to help skipping and wayfinding. And this applies primarily to the core application. The core application gathers information that's needed for both the federal and the local program. You can think of this sort of as the center of the Venn diagram. And it's information like the names of the people in your household, household earnings, if you have any, savings, certain out-of-pocket expenses that can be used to increase the value of your voucher, requests for accommodation to make sure your unit is accessible. But even within that packet, it's not the case that every question may fit your circumstances. And so some skipping is needed. And so we use a couple strategies to facilitate that. If you go to the next slide, Nellie. So the first is that we break the application into logically coherent parts and we label them. Debra showed you the current packet that asks people to list their household information twice. That's not the case anymore. So what you see on the screen here is part 3. It's focused on income. It's really the only place we ask you in the application about household income. And we do our very best with the size of the typeface, the color, the use of white space to make both the part label and the topic as prominent as possible so you can identify it quickly even if you're flipping through an application. The next strategy is including on every page a description of the conditions under which the page is needed. Everyone needs to complete parts 1 through 8 of the packet. And so that's what this note says on the top. And so if you're on part 3, you know this applies to you, hopefully. There are also other sections that say only complete this if you're instructed to in part 4 to help people, help facilitate skipping. And then one other strategy is we let folks know when they can leave a section blank using prominent visual design, which if you go to the next slide, Nellie will circle. We found during discovery that many folks felt uncomfortable leaving sections blank, even if they could have. And so we try to call out that with a really prominent note that you can skip this section if it doesn't apply to you very clearly. And we integrate that into the flow by having a checkbox that people can check to say, yes, this doesn't apply to me. And that does a couple things. It helps address the urge to do something and just not skip. It also helps confirm understanding and shows that this shows to the person who's reviewing the application that the section was skipped intentionally. So if you go to the next slide, Nellie, I want to talk about a slightly different situation. There's some information in the core application that's required only if a certain situation applies, and that situation doesn't often apply. Take, for instance, the example of household assets. Assets are things like savings, real estate, investments. Currently, the Housing Authority only really needs to know more about your assets if your family has $15,000 or more. And that doesn't apply to many people applying for a voucher. And so because we're concerned about people filling out information they don't need to, we fudge our rule about only asking about a certain topic in one section just a little bit. So here's the asset section. And we asked just one question instead of the big table that was present in the current application. It asks basically, does the case that you have assets more than $15,000 apply to you? If the answer is no, then check the box and you've completed the application, this part of the application in one question, which we think is a big improvement. But if the answer is yes, then you need to pay attention to part 9, which is farther down in the core application, behind things like disclosures and signatures. It feels a little bit like an addendum, and that's partially the intent, to allow most folks to who it doesn't apply to feel comfortable just moving on beyond it. The gamble here, and which we've been testing, is do we do enough with wayfinding to help folks find those farther down parts to make sure they complete them? And so far, we're finding that it's working fairly well, but we're still working on it. Nellie, if you go to the next slide, I want to show you what this looks like in practice. So this is the core application. It's 14 pages. If you go to the next slide, this shows you sort of the most common situation. So this is a household of fewer than 6 people, or 6 people or fewer, with some income without needing to declare assets or unreimbursed expenses. And so you only complete the first 8 pages. Now let's say you had some unreimbursed disability expenses that you wanted to show. You would check a box in farther up in the application and also complete part 11. And so that's how it sort of intended to work in practice. One final strategy for creating a smooth flow through the paper application is on the next slide. And so what you're seeing on the screen right here is the information page in the revised application. You'll notice that the first step is completing all the forms we were just talking about. However, the second step is providing the documents you need to allow the housing authority to verify the information that you entered on the forms. The housing authority needs to verify information like your legal name, date of birth, social security number if you have it, employment income, and some other things. If these verifications can't be done, the application is delayed. And we found that that's a really big source of delay, particularly if folks are hard to track down after the application is completed. So the first best option is to provide information like government IDs, birth certificates, or pay stubs. But if you can't easily provide that as proof, you can complete another form. And those forms are currently included in the application packet, even though it's not ideal that you use them. And again, we found that many people are filling out these verification forms, sort of the information about the information, even though they don't need to, because either it's not clear exactly what you need to verify something, or people feel uncomfortable leaving information blank. So to avoid the time and potential discomfort involved in providing this type of verification information, some of which needs to go to your employer or your doctor or your child's school and have them sign off on it, we've decided to just take these out of the packet and instead include a table, which I'll show you on the next slide. So this provides a bit of ground truth for everybody. In column 1, you see what you need to verify. This is just a subset. In column 2, you see who we need the information about, and sometimes it's not everyone in the household. And then column 3, it's an exhaustive list of documents that you can use to verify that information. So for instance, if you're applying for a locally funded voucher, you need to verify your residency in DC. That only needs to be for the applicant, and you can use a variety of forms to do that, including a government issued ID, pay stubs, tax records, a lease, bank statements, benefits records, and medical records. And that goes all the way down to everything that needs to be verified. Now, in some cases, it's not convenient to provide those documents. And so there are verification forms. And that shows up in the next column, which Nellie's just showed you. There's 11 verification forms total. That's how we go from the 23 pages of the core and federal supplement all the way up to 34. In practice, you generally don't need more than a handful. Like for instance, there's forms to both verify that you have income and don't have income, and you wouldn't use both. Because we want people to not waste time filling out things they don't need to, these are included as links in the application packet. So if you have a smartphone or a computer, you can download them, or a case manager can provide them. But of course, we know that tables can be difficult to read, and it's not an ideal solution for everybody. So we're really focusing on testing this to see if it works. Which brings us to the last poll, which I want to queue up now, and people can respond to while I hand it over to Nellie. This is, let's see. Oh, sorry. This is a poll you should see that asks you, what do you think is the biggest pain point identified by residents when they were testing that table? And includes confusion about the purpose of the table, missed categories, people missed categories that applied to them. People provided information on categories that they did not need to apply to. People provided information on categories that they did not apply to them. People provided more documents than they needed to for categories that applied to them, or they didn't have easy access to the acceptable documents. Nellie's going to talk about some strategies to mitigate some of these concerns, but we're really curious to think what your first takes are on this piece. So Nellie, over to you. I'll close the poll in just a minute.
All right, thank you. And Tina, I see you there that we just have a couple minutes left. So I'll keep it brief. So we've just spent a lot of time telling you all the things that we thought that we could do with paper to make this application easier in our particular context. But we know that there's still a lot of ways in which paper is not the full solution for us. And so we've started to explore some digital solutions that can complement the paper revision. And this is at really early stages compared to the redesign as a whole. I just wanted to include some of our thoughts about what we felt like we couldn't do with paper. And rather than seeing paper and digital as alternatives, we're really exploring them more as complements. So right now we're looking at solutions that would help applicants navigate that verification process Ryan just described more easily, and solutions that would better protect their data. So again, you can see this table as Ryan described, and I'm eager to see what you all thought about what the biggest pain point would be. It does provide a ground truth, and it's a helpful resource, particularly for case managers. But the complex logic, and I'll say there's actually 9 categories here. We've simplified it even for you. So this logic, it's oversimplified for somebody who is otherwise unfamiliar with the program requirements. It felt necessary, but not ideal. And in testing, applicants and case managers, they were almost universally able to identify which documents they would need based off of this table. But many times they over-selected out of caution. So for example, some people just read straight down column 3. That was something that we saw in a few instances. They started going across the row, but then they just kept going down column 3, and that led them to over-select. Other people over-selected on purpose, out of caution. Even we asked them, did you notice that instruction at the top about submit 1 for each row? And they're like, yeah, I saw that, but I'm still going to submit this, this, and that. And so that was really helpful for us to learn as well. So I'm just showing here a mock-up of something like a quiz that somebody could use to check if their application is complete. This is very low fidelity, like just for the purpose of showing you all what we're thinking of. And so somebody would answer a few questions: what kind of voucher they have, how many people are in their household, and whether or not there's anybody in their household enrolled in kindergarten through 12th grade, for example. Maybe a few more questions after that. The tool, it would tell them what things they need to submit, a core application, local supplement, and what things they need to show proofs for. And the final version of this would also give them options for which proof they would submit. And then for data security, this tool ideally would also offer folks the option of uploading each of these things that it has prompted them that they need to make sure that their application is complete. And they would only need to upload 1 item for each. And, you know, this might end up looking very different. It might even be built directly in one of the agency systems. But we just wanted to give you a sense of how a low fidelity digital solution could complement what we've done without a soup to nuts digital application process. So to give you a sense of what we feel like we maybe have accomplished by now, remember this is still in progress. We have been able to reduce the overall number of forms required in the application process. And we've also brought the reading level down from an average of around 6 to 7 to an average of 4 to 5. And I was going to tell you more about our next steps, and certainly I'm very excited about them, but I think I'm just going to finish here. And maybe we'll talk about next steps in the Q&A. But here you see every page of the core and supplement in the current version on the left, and in the revised version on the right. And just for one example, here's somebody who is applying for a federal voucher off the wait list. They would have needed 28 pages from the old application. And on the right, you'll see that they would need 17 from the new one. So I'm going to skip through the next steps, but I might come back to it later if it is relevant to the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you, Debra, Ryan, and Nellie. This is really exciting. And there's a lot of questions in the chat, so eager to get to those. We've got about 15 minutes remaining in our time. So I'm going to start with a sort of straightforward question, since our speakers just did a bunch of great presenting. We had a question both from Andy and Kelly in the chat. What tool are you using to design the redesigned forms?
I can take this one. We are building these in Microsoft Word.
Yes, I love it.
We are trying to keep it as evergreen as we can. This is a tool that everybody in DCHA and everybody in DHS knows how to use already. The lab are sort of, we are here to support and be through the process of rollout, but we will not always be hand-holding with our partners on these forms. We are also, though we have designer in our title, not all graphic designers. And so our skill levels vary. Microsoft Word is not ideal. I spent lots of hours moving rows and tables. Even today, somebody asked me if I could change the type of bullet point in that document guide. And I'm like, I think that will take me at least an hour. And so Microsoft Word, a little bit rough, but ultimately we think it's the best decision. And that's how we have actually designed every paper form that the lab has redesigned, which is about 50 now.
That's great. Thank you, Nellie. And what I do appreciate about that is through this work, you're building in sustainability from day one. You're not using a maybe unknown software that would be harder for somebody to adjust later. So it just makes great sense. And Nellie, you can feel free to take down your slides if you'd like. I'm going to move on to some questions we got related to sort of the user experience and testing that you all did. So first, Kelly asked, how did you do testing for the paper forms? What did that look like?
Should I take that one again, Ryan? Would you like to do?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and have Debra and Nellie support.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think the first thing to note is that the testing starts even before you have a prototype. That you want to dig deep on the form as it currently exists to understand really if you can't do everything, you need to make compromises. What's really causing a problem for the user experience? And here, we really focused on core users, which are our applicants and the staff that support them at the Housing Authority and the Department of Human Services and others. And so we led a fairly lengthy discovery process that involved sitting with users and both staff and residents as they completed the form, and then forming some theories about what's the problem and digging deeper through interviews and some sort of putting paper in front of people. With the prototypes themselves, the testing was more extensive than we often do because there's so many different forms with so many different potential users. And so we started with small tests of individual things built to testing the packets themselves and how they performed in terms of time and effort. And then when it came to verification forms, needed to sort of reach out wider beyond our core users because people who are filling that also are school administrators or staff at doctors' offices. Or someone who's like a neighbor at your church who's giving you a bit of money. These are all sort of potential users. And so we needed to spread the net wide. And then, you do that over and over again. You make changes, you go back, you make changes, you go back. Things that I'm sure everyone on this conference is fairly familiar with. Nellie and Debra, what would you add to that overview?
I would just say that so far we've mainly tested, maybe you said this right, I missed it, these paper forms in paper. We printed them out and we took them to people and we asked them to write on them. Folks like Debra on the DCHA side, they wrote along on a few of these tests. And though many times, and there's some discussion in the chat, these are going to be used as fillable PDFs. We really wanted to get the content right first. And then we'll do some usability testing of that fillable PDF. Sometimes it's hard to get people to actually write on the form. They just want to tell you their opinion. But that worked out really well for us.
Debra, is there anything you want to add to that, just in terms of thinking about, the users or the clients, the residents that are engaged here? What would you add?
I would just add that, just in general, I'm glad that we're going through this, process because The forms we've had them since like 2006. So, we've gotten a lot of feedback, through the years, and we're constantly sending things back and forth, but we never got to a point where we had the time or the ability or expertise to do something about that. So, and I'm, glad that this process extended, to people who would actually be using the forms.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's such a wonderful point you make about you've been hearing feedback over the years, but this is an opportunity to really focus on that and intentionally make that space. So that's great. Thank you. I think during as you all were sharing the sort of wayfinding in terms of the approach that you're using, we had some great questions that I want to pose here. Sean asked, what's the guidance you're using when it comes to things like emphasis in terms of when you're bolding or italicizing, thinking about the font size versus case? How do you think about that? I know that's a bit of a technical question, but I imagine many attendees are wondering.
Ryan, do you want to take that one too?
Yes. So I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that we want everything to sort of meet the web standards for legibility, because a lot of these will be read on the screen, and so there's tools to test that in terms of size, in terms of color contrast, in terms of typeface and all of that. Beyond that, the main thing we go for is a clear hierarchy and information allow people to sort of scan and get to where they need to be quickly. What is this section about? Where am I being asked to input information? Some of that is a bit of an amalgam of our past experience in testing. The Housing Authority's own sort of style guide and design guide, and then taking an iterative approach to testing, seeing how navigation goes. I don't know if I'd like to say that everything is sort of planned out, but I mean, obviously there's a bit of preference and style involved there as well. But we're really focused on keeping a clear hierarchy and keeping it consistent, and making sure it passes some basic tests. So that's the approach. I hope that answers the question well enough.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a follow-up question. This came from Jillian. How do you take into consideration a range of reading abilities? But then also, things come up like translations to other languages, even the size of font for, folks like my mom who, may have a vision impairment and would benefit from not squinting at such tiny text. How have y'all thought about that?
Yeah, I'll take that at least to start on the reading level, because I did the work to try to measure the reading level of the old and the new forms in their entirety in preparation for today. It's quite tricky overall to measure the reading level of an entire form, because those individual fields can really bring down the average. So there are places in our forms that, despite the average reading level being around a grade 4 or grade 5, there are paragraphs that are grade 12 or even higher. And those are the sort of legalese pieces that, we can't get away from. And I imagine other people are encountering the same problems. And so we really think carefully about when we have a paper, like something that somebody's agreeing to, that we know is going to sort of contain some legal language. On one of the slides, Ryan showed the sort of step-by-step process, the way that we've laid it out. And in that step-by-step, it lists all the forms and the supplements, which mainly are the ones with all the legalese. And we make a point of explaining on that first page what somebody is going to find in that authorization that they're signing later on. We can't change the authorization. HUD has written it. It is OMB stamped. There's nothing much that we can do on the text of that itself.
Right.
And there's a few other places where, like with immigration status or citizenship for federal voucher applicants, we've got to use some sort of very legal language, but we just make a point elsewhere in the forms to explain. And part of that is for the applicants themselves, and part of that's for the case managers, because the case manager who would walk an applicant in a local voucher program through the application, they would use that language even in our user test to say, okay, well then I would say that like what they're signing for here is X, Y, or Z. And we tried to provide as much of that information for the case manager as we could. In terms of other pieces of accessibility, we are looking at translation. I saw somebody in the chat. We do have a lot of experience with translation at the lab now. And so we have some thoughts about how to do it, but at least for the pilot period and the initial rollout, it will be in English. As we update the form based on what we learn in the pilot and the initial rollout, we'll be looking at those translations to roll them out a couple months later. Those will mostly be needed for the federal voucher applicants who are largely filling out the forms on their own. Local voucher applicants, even in the medium term, when we don't have the translations yet, they would be able to use a language line with their case manager to fill out the forms. One of the tricks that we're worried about with translations is that there's some forms that the applicant fills out the top and a third party fills out the bottom. I mentioned those employers, those schools, the notaries. And we are a little not sure exactly how to address those particular forms, right? Where the top half is filled out by one person, bottom half by somebody else. They might have different language preferences. So if anybody here has any thoughts on that, we would be very interested if you could share them in the chat.
Hey, I love a call to action with a engaged audience like we have today. I think we have time for one more question. And I'm very sorry for those questions we didn't get to, but there's a question that Andy dropped in the chat that I think could be a great way to sort of wrap this session. Debra, I think in particular, you may have thoughts on this. Andy asks, do you think it's possible that findings in the form redesign process, all this work that you've been sharing out, is it possible that any of that will change, simplify, or standardize housing eligibility policy?
Not the policy, no, because we have, regulations, local and federal government regulations that guide our policies. So, unfortunately, no.
Yeah. We can dream a dream, but
right.
As Nellie mentioned a little bit ago, that isn't under your control.
Right.
Yeah. Let me see. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that was a quick answer, Debra. Thank you. Let's see. Let me ask a follow-up, Nellie, to you were just speaking about in terms of like taking into consideration reading abilities, translations. Molly asks, you mentioned the legal language that you sort of put as an appendix. Is that legal language counted in the reading accessibility measurement when you do that assessment of reading level?
Yes, it is when we use the reading formula. I really appreciate the resource Caroline shared because I was looking for something like that. So I'm excited to look at it. But even as the legalese is included, the way that reading level formulas work, it really, it's discounted because the legalese makes up a sort of smaller part of the forms. So when we did it, I looked at the average level of the whole form. And when I took those averages, I also looked at the mode. So I was interested in like what was the most common reading level, and it had been 8 and it is 4. But then for each form, I also looked at what is the highest rated paragraph in this form. And those were 12 or more on some forms. And that's something that we were sort of interested in. Did it change? Did it not change? And I'm still digging more into it. It's very much a work in progress. So really excited for any resources anybody has to share about that.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that brings us just about to time. So I know the three of you cannot see the nearly 100 people who are listening in and joining the session, but we're all just giving gratitude and appreciation for the work you're doing and for you sharing it out. I want to say thanks to everyone for joining today's session. I'll